Good morning. Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, with the solemn sound of Vilnius University Aula Parva organ, we would like to warmly welcome you in our interdisciplinary research workshop, FinTech, Finance, Technology and Regulation in Vilnius. We are happy to see you all gathered here, and also we warmly would like to greet and to welcome the participants watching the broadcast of our official opening through Arcus and Vilnius University YouTube channels. Part of our activities will be broadcasted. Today we will have the broadcast of keynote of official opening and also keynote speaker. Tomorrow also we will have the broadcast of Keynote Lecture, and on the third day we will have open access on YouTube channel representing also the good practices and funding opportunities. This event is organized in the framework of Horizon 2020 project, Arcus RI, which unites the Arcus European University Alliance and brings together the Universities of Bergen, Granada, Graz, Leipzig, Lyon, Padua, Vilnius, and also the new members, Minho and Wrocław. Long-standing, prestigious, comprehensive, research-intensive universities who share extensive experience in joint projects and a similar profile as internationalized institutions with deep regional engagement. So in the beginning, I would kindly like to invite a Pro-Rector for Organizational Development and Community Affairs, Mrs. Rita Ricosciute-Balsiene, to warmly welcome you today.
Dear colleagues, I'm glad to welcome you in one of the oldest universities in Eastern Europe. Thank you for participating in the event, which provides opportunities to get to know each other, raise new ideas, exchange experience, and awake innovative cross-disciplinary collaboration possibilities. The ideas we are going to hear during this workshop will highlight the importance of FinTech to the industry and to the society, and I wish and I hope it will make people's life easy. I'm certain that this event will be a valuable addition to your scientific work, and you will have great time exploring our university and Vilnius city. Thank you and have a good time.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. The second welcome word we would like to invite Professor Aida Mačerinskienė. She is Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration. The floor is yours.
I was listening for the music and thinking, you know, sometimes it's really very strange to combine everything in one platform: music, technologies, university, scientists, practitioners, spendings, and a lot of different things. And actually, it's not really very easy to find the right solution. So today, I hope that we are starting the workshop, which will give you possibility to find new solutions, new networks, new contacts, new ideas, and I hope that this start will give you the right way for future research. But at the beginning, I would like to start also the formal speech, because university's environment gives us let's say, some duty to understand where we are and what we need to feel being in the workshop. So the 21st century gifted society a trust of information technologies. And it makes it starts with really very small amount of the scientists, which started actually technologies, which started innovations. The youth of our society is an important part of society. Their speed and abilities are the source of change in the world. The curiosity, creativity, and the drive for the best result possible are crucial for Vilnius University. The values of Vilnius University, honestly, integrity, evolution, and longevity, always emphasize the importance of studies and science, possibilities of modernizing scientific research, and the significance of universities in this interdisciplinarity, internationality, and collaboration. Together, these challenges signify the importance of the fragility of values and the meaning of historical merit fortification. It opens new partnership opportunities to students, to the wide world, to members of society, curious researcher, or just the people who would like to get some knowledge. For me, financial technology is an example of innovation combining maths, information technologies, law, and finance. On the other hand, finance technology is the technology that creates and legalizes an international currency. Actually, financial technology is opening up the possibility of various cryptocurrencies. That is to say, currencies that open, I would say, up many borders and change many things in the world. These technologies strengthen some and weaken others. But perhaps the most important thing is that this event is taking place here in Vilnius University. And I believe that this workshop is beginning of the new possibilities for all of us. I wish you all a great and fruitful time, more networking opportunities, and endless scientific curiosity. Thank you for visiting Lithuania.
Thank you very much. So further on, we will proceed with the workshop idea presentation and a little bit about the program and information package you received today in the morning. So there are already in existence a number of research collaborations between members of the Arcus Alliance. However, in order to enhance cooperation and tap into its full potential, the exchange of research ideas and expertise is essential for us. So in the framework of Arcus RI, a series of 4 large workshops has been opened already by our colleagues in Graz last month in beautiful Kassel. There was a workshop on climate risks in a changing world. They help researchers to become familiar with ongoing work and existing research infrastructures at the other partners, and also supported the pursuit of common research interests. So we are opening another set of workshops. The first one is here in Vilnius, related to artificial intelligence, and another one will be organized in Lyon in June, so pretty soon, and it will be held from 1st to 3rd of June. We kindly invited researchers and academics representing all career stages and all disciplines or cross-disciplinary research field from Arcus universities to participate in this workshop. Each connection, the ideas in the relevant areas with different approaches on the topic and motivation to share your insights among colleagues from different science fields are welcome. Topics of the workshop you can find in the agenda. So we have 6 topics which are important for us and for you. So the first one is European FinTech policy, risks, regulatory strategies, and consumer protection. The second one is computational finance, crypto assets, blockchain technology, algo and high-frequency trading, hedging and investing strategies. The third topic is artificial intelligence in the data-intensive domains of finance, government, business, big data analytics. The fourth one is security and privacy solutions. The fifth is RegTech, technologies for supervision and compliance. And the sixth topic is digital transformation, banking, investment, insurance, environment, health, energy, and etc. Based on the goal to build a community of researchers, the workshop, this workshop and all the workshops in this project are set up as a mixture between getting to know each other, a brokerage event, and networking. So it's a mixture of event. It's not a conference. In the workshop, the participants are expected to introduce others with ongoing research projects and priorities, identified prioritized research topics for the future, and discuss concrete ideas for research projects and open funding calls. So in your information package, you also received the set and the list of possible calls that would attract your attention. So you will have the possibility to watch them through, and as a base, it will serve as a basis later on when you will have the break into the groups, the networking in the groups. And the participants in the workshop will have the chance by different working ways to reflect on the interdisciplinary ideas generated together with colleagues from Arcus universities, thus creating not only networking opportunities, but also developing their identity as an Arcus research community, hopefully culminating in joint research efforts for joint publications and research projects. So we are looking forward to exchanging research and to establishing, fostering, and developing sustainable contacts with the Arcus community in the determined research area, as well as creating together new interdisciplinary synergies among research teams. You can see that on the second day we will have the keynote lecture by Professor Andrei Kirilenko, and also we will have a discussion among researchers, experts, and also FinTech companies representatives. So the second day is dedicated to synergies between research and business. So we will have the opportunity to discuss with the business representatives about their needs, about their expectations from research. Then we will have, on the second day, we will have the session by working in groups together with business, and the second networking will be among the researchers. So it will be moderated also by Vice Dean for Partnership and Projects of the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration. So this is the second day, and the third day we will have, in the beginning, we will have the exchange on the best practices by Linas Butėnas, Faculty of Mathematics and Informatics. And then we will have the session on funding opportunities. We have invited the representatives from European Commission to present us the policy on FinTech. Also, we will have the representative from DG Research and Innovation, also from European Innovation Council and SMEs Executive Agency, and also we will have the NCPs, National Contact Points for Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, as an opportunity also to hear about the possibilities for doctoral networks, staff exchanges, and postdoctoral fellowships to hear the main requirements of Marie Skłodowska-Curie program calls. So thank you very much for attending, for participating today, and I wish you all very pleasure networking. I wish you all great interaction between each other, and also very important thing that we would like to mention is that as organizers of this event, to achieve the purpose of this event, we kindly invite you to participate in every part of the program that you see on the agenda. So including the official part, the networking, and also the social program that will continue today and tomorrow. So have a pleasant time. Thank you very much for attention, and let's finish our official opening right now. So further on, we continue with a keynote lecture by Professor Simon Chesterman, Dean of Provost Chair Professor and the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law and Senior Director of Artificial Intelligence Governance and Artificial Intelligence Singapore. Professor, are you online? Okay, we see you. Hi, hello.
Good morning.
Can we
or
hear
good
you
afternoon
also?
from Singapore.
Can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can
Okay,
you hear me?
wonderful. Yes, we can hear you. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So, Prorector, Dean, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be joining you, albeit virtually. When I first received the invitation, I thought, fantastic. I've never been to Vilnius. It would be wonderful to visit Lithuania. I see on the agenda that you're doing a walk in the old town this afternoon. Unfortunately, I can't be there. But I do think that the in-person experience that you have right now, that we're progressively going back to in Singapore, is vital in general for research and education, but particularly for interdisciplinary education, because it requires people to have conversations on the margins. And maybe before I get into my remarks, just to say a couple of words about interdisciplinarity, because that's something that we are also exploring in depth in Singapore. There's a famous building at MIT, which was in the Second World War. It was used as the focal point for radar research. It was called Building 20. And because it was during the Second World War, it was constructed very quickly, designed only to last for 5 years. But after the end of the Second World War, and there was successful development of radar, after the Second World War, it was kind of where the unloved parts of MIT were put on a temporary basis. And this temporary building ended up lasting until the 1980s. But when you combine some obscure computer scientists and linguistics, you found that people like Noam Chomsky made connections with computer scientists. You had an incredible melting pot of ideas. And around the world, I think universities are struggling to replicate that kind of creativity. And it's a challenge because there's a bit of a mismatch between what we say and what we do. We all agree that interdisciplinarity is vital to solving the complex problems of the world today. But at the same time, most of us exist in universities that are rigidly discipline focused. And certainly myself as Dean of a law school, I have to mentor colleagues who need to get promoted within their discipline. So there is a challenge there, although I think we're working out ways to address it. And one of it is through the organization that was just kindly mentioned, AI Singapore, where I run the governance program, but that's in partnership. I'm the lawyer and there's a computer scientist alongside me, Jungpil Han. And I think that's something that we need to add into the structure of universities increasingly, nudging, forcing us to cross our disciplinary boundaries. Moving to the context of artificial intelligence regulation in particular, I remember there was an exchange on Twitter I saw some months back, always a great source of academic rigor and thought through ideas. But the complaint was a computer scientist saying, these people who criticize or pontificate about AI ethics should all go and get a computer science degree before they come talking to us. To which the riposte from someone was, well, these computer scientists who are radically changing the way in which we interact with the world around us and with each other should maybe think about getting either a degree in philosophy or in ethics before they start going down their path. So all this to say that interdisciplinarity is vital, and it certainly infuses my own work. Although I am not a technologist, I'm not a computer scientist, I come at this from the direction of regulation, from the direction of law. And in terms of my own trajectory, the way in which I got interested in the regulation of artificial intelligence was a little bit unusual because my own background originally was in public international law. My doctorate was on humanitarian intervention, whether and how, if a state turns on its own population or begins to collapse, others can intervene to save that population. And it's really a question of public authority in crisis. I subsequently looked at external administration, so whether the UN can and should take over territories like Kosovo, East Timor, and so on. I've looked at the regulation of national intelligence services, but the through line was always public authority in crisis. How can governments, democratically or otherwise politically legitimate institutions regulating public power, how can and should they respond to challenges to their authority? And technology, as I'll go on to talk about in a few minutes, potentially offers a similar challenge, not quite on the scale necessarily of terrorism or state collapse, but it is a challenge to regulation in the sense of public control of a set of activities in order to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms to a population. So that you're not just looking at a picture of me, I've got some slides to help illustrate some of this. And I'll speak for 30, 45 minutes at absolute most, and then we're going to try and have some time for Q&A, which is, again, one of the things I'd be most interested in. And I'm sorry I can't be there to carry on that conversation over coffee afterwards. So in terms of the regulation of AI, I like to start with this slide, which is a photograph from 1956 at Dartmouth College. And this is the summer in which the term artificial intelligence is widely regarded to have been coined. And it was basically a group of researchers who had got money from the Rockefeller Foundation for a retreat over 2 months. And I highlight this slide partly for the historical interest, but also because it highlights two problems with artificial intelligence research, even up until today. The first is the complete lack of diversity. It's a bunch of white guys. And in the early days of artificial intelligence, that really did reflect the reality. Today, it's a much more diverse group of people who are active in the area, although AI still has a diversity problem in terms of the data that it draws upon, which can lead to biased outcomes, which is something we might talk about later on. The second reason I think this slide is illuminating is because it highlights the often irrational exuberance of AI researchers. So these men got money from the Rockefeller Foundation on the basis of a request for funding over the summer, saying that they believed that with funding for 2 months, they could probably solve most of the problems confronting artificial intelligence. Now, more than half a century on, clearly we're still grappling with some of those. And this has been one of the real challenges, in addition to bias in AI, a challenge of mismatched expectations. This is the difference between expectations and reality, leading to the coining of the term AI winter to describe the collapse of expectations when those expectations are not satisfied. So about a decade after this image, we have another theme in the context of AI, which is fear of AI. And this is a still from the film 2001, released in 1968, Stanley Kubrick's film. Arthur C. Clarke's book of the same name came out in the same year. And this is an image from when Hal, the apparently sentient computer, is explaining to the crew members why its mission is more important than their lives. And this fear of technology is not, of course, limited to AI. Fear of technology regularly comes up in the context of new developments. What is perhaps a little bit unusual in the context of AI is that these fears are not being expressed merely by Luddites, people who are fearing technology in the abstract without knowing much about it. Many of these fears are expressed by those who actually understand the technology quite deeply. So we've got people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, the late Stephen Hawking, expressing concern about developments in AI, which, if they were coming from members of the fringe, would simply be dismissed. But since they're coming from people who do really understand the technology, they're at least worth taking seriously. So what is the challenge of AI for regulation? In some ways, it's a general challenge of new technology, but there are some unique things about AI. But very quickly, what are we talking about here? I won't go into this in depth, but by artificial intelligence, I'm referring to a broad suite of technologies that undertake activities or cognitive functions that would normally be performed by a human. For the most part, I'll be talking about narrow AI, that is specific tasks, rather than general AI. Although the prospect of a superintelligence that is smarter than us, more powerful than us, is not impossible, it's not going to be the focus of my presentation today. By robotics, I mean the engineering feat of machines engaging with the world. Machine learning is the ability of certain AI systems to learn themselves, to enhance their understanding of the world without additional information or input from humans. You combine AI and machine learning, and you get tools like AlphaGo, which was the Go playing algorithm that defeated Lee Sedol back in 2016. It is kind of striking the extent to which the history of AI has been measured in games. Interesting in part, I suppose, because it's an easily understandable mental contest where a machine can be pitted against a human. And so we've seen success for AI in Go, chess, even games like Jeopardy, poker, and so on. The reason I say it's a little bit unusual is that the purpose of a game, the function of a game usually is to have fun. And if there's one thing we can say about AI systems is that they're not really necessarily having fun. But that's one possible application. Machine learning, if you add AI and robotics, you get things like autopilots. And if you add machine learning and robotics, you get things like the Roomba, the vacuum cleaner that can learn the dimensions of your house. So what are the challenges to law? Because new technology has always challenged law, but there are some interesting ways in which artificial intelligence has posed some fairly specific challenges, and I group them into three. The first is simply speed. And an illustration of this is the flash crash from about 12 years ago. Now, if I was to be engaged in securities transactions, buying and selling stocks or options, then a certain set of rules apply. And the same rules apply whether it's a human buying or selling those stocks or options or a machine. But what we discovered in 2010 was that the mere fact that machines could do this much faster actually introduced regulatory challenges. So instead of, say, you and me engaging in a couple of dozen transactions if we were acting very quickly on a regular basis, you had high-frequency trading algorithms that were engaging in tens of thousands of trades every second. And this is how the New York Stock Exchange lost $1 trillion in value, at the time its biggest ever point drop, in 30 minutes. And then in 15 minutes, restored most of that value. And no one really understood what was happening at the time. And so that's, I think, a pretty basic illustration. There are other examples you could give in terms of speed, such as the ability to transmit information around the world. But I think this idea that the speed of certain technologies poses regulatory challenges when we assume a human-based timescale. And when things happen at speed, it challenges that. And occasionally, you have to address it. One way in which that's been addressed in high-frequency trading algorithms is through imposing speed bumps or circuit breakers to slow things down in the event that there's a big drop like that one. The other way in which it's been really interesting to have a consideration of the management of speed is to take away some of the incentive. Because one example of how important speed is that there was a Chicago-based trading house which paid tens of millions of dollars to lay a fiber optic cable between Chicago and New Jersey in order to shave 3 milliseconds off the amount of time it took a signal to go through the telephone wires. Instead, they had their own dedicated straight line fiber optic cable. So all this to say, speed is a challenge. Second, and this is more focused on artificial intelligence, is autonomy. This is the idea that a machine can take decisions without additional input from a human. And a pretty easy example of this is autonomous vehicles. And for many people, the idea of cars taking decisions autonomously are a bit of a challenge. They worry about cars making the right decision. You have endless debates about trolley problems. Should the car be programmed in such a way as to save children or kill the driver? An interesting footnote on that is that there was a detailed survey published in Science, the journal, which asked in a limit scenario if the choice for the car was reduced to killing 10 school children or driving off a cliff and killing the driver, what should it do? A majority of people said it should kill the driver, save the children. The follow-up question was, would you ever get into a car programmed in this way? And the majority of people said no. So certainly car manufacturers are saying that they would prioritize driver safety. And in reality, many of these limit scenarios are pretty unrealistic. The legal challenge is one of responsibility. If such a vehicle were to injure someone or to run a red light, who, if anyone, should be held to blame? And actually, neither of these problems is particularly difficult. In terms of injury, it's already the case. If I were to injure one of you by negligently driving my car in a manner that caused injury to you, then you or your estate might be able to sue me. If, however, I injured you because you were standing next to my car and the car blew up, well, there's not much point suing me because I'm dead, but you might be able to sue the car's manufacturer under product liability. And basically what we're going to see with autonomous vehicles is a shift of responsibility from responsibility of drivers to responsibility of producers towards product liability, where either the owner or the manufacturer or potentially the user is going to be held responsible for the machine itself and any malfunction, with insurance playing a bridging role. So at the moment, I think this is the case in Lithuania. It's certainly the case here in Singapore. It's mandatory to have insurance in order to drive on the roads. And that means personal liability insurance for me. What we're going to see most likely over the coming decades as we move to autonomous vehicles is a shift to requiring product liability insurance for the vehicle. So not particularly complicated. It is a little bit trickier when we turn from civil law to criminal law. So that's not the question of who should be compensated in the event of loss, but in the case of criminal law, if an autonomous vehicle runs a red light, who gets fined? And this really raises interesting questions about the reason we have a criminal law in the first place, which is a mix of deterrence, rehabilitation, and other factors that are intended to shape human behavior. When you apply that not to a human, but to a machine, is there really much point in fining the machine? Or should you regard a violation of the criminal law not as a sin to be expunged, but rather as an error to be debugged? So some interesting questions there about autonomy. So in addition to speed and autonomy, the third challenge that AI systems at the moment pose to traditional notions of regulation, which is a little bit more focused on current developments in AI, is opacity. And this is something that's really emerged over the past decade with new machine learning techniques, deep learning techniques, neural nets, where increasingly there are AI systems that are not just hard to understand, they are literally impossible to understand. Even for experts, there may be billions of variables and it may be impossible for an AI system to give an explanation that is comprehensible to a human. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't ways of addressing this, but there are costs associated with those ways. So for example, if you have billions of variables, it might be too complex for a human to understand. If you simplify it, however, you may get greater understanding, but that might be at the expense of accuracy. Now, it's important to recognize that we don't actually need to understand everything in the world. If I had been able to fly to Lithuania for this event, the fact that I don't have a detailed understanding of aerodynamics wouldn't prevent me getting on an aeroplane. I trust that there are people who do. In the medical field, there are all sorts of areas in which we don't, in fact, have a deep understanding of how certain medical procedures function. Certain pharmaceuticals, we accept work on the basis of statistical trials, clinical trials where we roll out a certain treatment, we have a placebo, we have a control group, and we make a determination based on the statistics that if a certain treatment yields a positive outcome in a satisfactory number of cases with an acceptable number of side effects, then we will roll that out, even if we don't understand at a molecular level how it in fact works. The situation is even more extreme in the area of psychiatry, where there are many practices which we really don't understand, even sometimes controversial ones, such as electroconvulsive therapy, where certain forms of depression appear to respond well to electroconvulsive therapy, and we actually don't understand why. So we don't need to understand everything in life, but there are some decisions where I think it is very important. And maybe this is because I'm a lawyer, but I do think there are some legal decisions where it is important that, for example, a judge makes a decision not based on the statistical history or the statistical data before him or her, but on the basis of an individualized determination of the case in a manner that is explainable to and understandable by the parties concerned. And indeed, this has been an issue in a number of countries around the world. There's a case from the United States from a few years back. There's software on trial in Malaysia right now, my neighbor in Singapore, where judges are relying on sentencing algorithms to recommend sentencing processes. China has gone even further in this area in terms of predictive decisions that are prompting judges to make determinations in a manner that would at least be controversial in many jurisdictions. So these three questions of speed, autonomy, and opacity do pose some challenges, although most of my work actually has been arguing in this area that most activities by artificial intelligence systems can be covered by most laws most of the time, but not all of them all of the time. So what should we do? Well, unfortunately, for the better part of a century, we've tended not to get much further than this guy. Some of you might recognize Isaac Asimov, the American science fiction author, famous, among other things, for his 3 laws of robotics. I won't go through them in detail. Hard to disagree that these are good things. What people misunderstand about Asimov is that he was a great science fiction writer, not so much a great legislator. And indeed, if his legislation, if his rules had worked, he would have been a very boring writer. Whereas in fact, the very first story in which he introduced these three laws, Runaround, published in 1942, showed how they didn't work. And indeed, much of his career was spent focusing on, much of his writing was focusing on the mismatch between the laws in theory and the laws in practice. And that, I think, gets at the heart of one of the challenges of regulating AI and a problem with the way in which many people think of it, which is that often people, I think, misconceive the problem as too hard and too easy. Too hard in that there's an assumption that we need all these new rules, when in fact, as I'll go on to show in a moment, I think most laws cover most AI systems most of the time. But that approach also misconceives the problem as too easy because it seems to assume that if only you had the right rules, applying them would be easy. Whereas in fact, it's the application. The devil is in those details. Nonetheless, over the past few years in particular, we've seen a proliferation of ethical guidelines, frameworks, principles, really taking off around 2016. And that's when they really began to explode. And there are literally hundreds of these adopted by countries, industry consortia, NGOs, groups of experts. The Pope endorsed one back in 2020. The EU, of course, now has its draft AI Act. UNESCO adopted a regulation last year. So what happened in this period to encourage this? And it wasn't just the realization that Asimov's laws weren't enough. What I think also was driving this was the realization that the consequences of AI systems gone wrong went beyond a driverless vehicle crashing into someone or a weird recommendation for your purchasing based on your purchasing history from Amazon. But the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which came to light between 2016 and 2018, I think revealed to many people that the consequences of these new technologies could go far beyond what we thought about before and could actually shape world history. Whether or not they in fact caused the election of Donald Trump, the potential for them to change an election result even in the most powerful country on the planet, I think was a real wake-up call. And so it was around this time that industry in particular started recognizing that the writing was on the wall, that there was going to be some kind of legislation forthcoming. And so even as the Europeans were starting to draft their AI Act, there was industry consortia trying to get ahead of this. So if you look at all of those guidelines, frameworks, principles, and so on, there's a great deal of overlap. And 6 principles in particular tend to come up all the time. Human control, transparency, safety, accountability, non-discrimination, privacy. Hard to disagree that all of these are good things and valid, worth including in a set of principles. But again, the question I would raise is, are they in fact necessary? Saying that these machines should be safed is another way of saying product liability should apply. It is, to be candid, kind of shocking that in 2022, it is still not clear whether software is a product for the purposes of product liability. There are different answers around the world, even in the European Union, even in the United Kingdom and the United States. It is not clear whether software is a product for these purposes. And it's partly because the definitions were established very early on. So if you go and buy a set of disks with a computer program on it, it probably is a product. But if you download it, it might not be. But if we could get product liability to cover at least embodied AI systems, so the Roomba from my earlier slide, the driverless vehicle, that will address a lot of concerns. Accountability is another way of saying that civil and criminal law should apply. Fancy way of saying that you shouldn't be able to do through an AI system something that you can't do yourself. Non-discrimination, of course, AI systems shouldn't be biased. People shouldn't be able to make biased decisions, at least against protected categories of bias. Corporations shouldn't be. And so the fact that they're doing it through an AI system shouldn't exempt them from that. Privacy is just another way of saying that data protection laws should apply. There is something a little bit different about human control and transparency, and that's where I've at least argued, along with many others, that we might want to have some special rules, essentially limiting the ability to develop AI systems that can get beyond human control or beyond human containment, and that we want to maintain a certain degree of transparency, at least in certain classes of decision. And transparency has to mean more than the idea that you can get an explanation when there's an adverse decision. That's often what is discussed in the EU context of a right to explanation, is the right to get reasons for the decision you don't like. That's a very limited interpretation of transparency because it presumes, one, that you knew there was a decision about you, two, that you've heard about it and that it was against you, and three, that it will be useful to get a response. So in situations where you are denied a loan, for example, that might in fact be useful, but given the spread of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making, we're going to see ever more of these decisions. And so transparency is going to have to mean more than just the ability to challenge adverse decisions, because so many decisions will be made about you. And so I'll argue later, at least in some classes of decisions, we want that transparency to be very clear. So why should we regulate, or why shouldn't we regulate? Rather than focusing on the what question, what the rules should be, I do think it's helpful to take a step back and ask why we're doing this in the first place. And if we take that sort of broad question of why public sector regulation is used in the first place, it tends to be for one of two reasons. First is to address market failures. It would be very inefficient, for example, if driverless vehicles, if the liability for injury by driverless vehicles just lay where it fell. So a pedestrian who was injured by a driverless vehicle, tough luck, you're on your own. Or if we imposed liability on driverless vehicles, for driverless vehicles on an owner who had no control over them. Basically, what I think we're likely to see in the context of AI is a shift similar to what we saw with product liability through the 20th century. Through the 20th century, most jurisdictions went from a system of caveat emptor, buyer beware, to putting responsibility onto the manufacturer. And the reason for that was reasonably clear. As the kind of materials we were using, as the products we were using got ever more complicated through the 20th century, it was clear that the ability to mitigate losses or to guard against them or to insure against them was much more likely to be successful if it was placed on the manufacturer rather than on the user. And so that's what we've seen around the world through the 20th century. And I think we'll see something similar in at least some use cases of AI. But it's not just a matter of making AI market efficient. There are some areas where we're not just trying to address market failures. Sometimes we are legislating or regulating in support of social or other policies. Even if, for example, you could demonstrate that it was efficient to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, and so on, most jurisdictions would conclude that that's inappropriate because these are protected categories. Because even if it were efficient to say, well, we're only going to hire women or men or people of a particular ethnicity, or we're only going to give loans to a particular sexual orientation, most of us, I think, would agree that that shouldn't happen, not because it's inefficient, but just because it's wrong. And so that's a separate reason for regulating. Against this is the question of why not regulate at all? Why not just hold back from regulating? And this is something we're very alive to here in Singapore, where there is a real wariness either of constraining innovation or losing our competitive advantage. So back in 2019, there was a review of our penal code that literally concluded that we will not impose criminal liability on AI systems for fear that it will drive innovation elsewhere. And there are occasional examples of this. When the United States, for example, in the George W. Bush administration 21 years ago, imposed a ban on stem cell research that was effective in stopping stem cell research in much of the United States, but that technology merely went elsewhere, including to places like Singapore. So we tend to have a kind of different set of approaches around the world, and I'll slightly exaggerate by grouping them into three broad approaches in terms of regulation. In the United States, the market has really dominated. The US doesn't have even a federal data protection law, let alone a federal AI law. And so in the United States, market actors tend to dominate, and Silicon Valley is a huge player in the regulatory space. The European Union, of course, is much more rights-focused, drawing on its history of the 20th century and the way in which data protection rights were developed and protected. We see a similar trend now with AI. Indeed, a lot of overlap with data protection, trying to guard against abuse of individuals. China, until recently, until about 6 months ago, I would have said was a very state sovereignty focused model. So if the US is market-oriented, the Europeans are rights-oriented, China was sovereignty-focused, viewing a lot of these questions through the lens of national security, requiring data localization within China and guarding against unnecessarily constraint of Chinese interests. But in the last 6 months, we've seen new legislation. The Personal Information Protection Act has come into force, and we've seen really extraordinary efforts to rein in technology companies, including requiring algorithmic transparency in a manner that would be very similar to the kind of language you hear in the European Union. It is, of course, being done for slightly different reasons. I think less of a focus on the individual rights of consumers and more the political interests of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, but in support of certain social values, on a par with, for example, the new rules concerning maximum number of hours that children can spend playing video games, or curbs on the tuition industry, but a different model of regulation. So these are some of the considerations that might go into the why question. What about the when question? When should we regulate? And this is something that many jurisdictions around the world are also grappling with. And here I'll fall back on what's called the Collingridge Dilemma. This is based on a book, or drawn from a book, The Social Control of Technology, that David Collingridge published in 1980, well before it became clear what AI would be. He was talking in general terms. And essentially, the dilemma that he pointed to was that in an early stage of development, it's easy to control a new technology, but you don't know enough to warrant slowing its development. You don't know enough what the harms would be. But if you wait too long, once those consequences become apparent, control is costly and slow. So if you think back to 2004, when Facebook was launched, or 2007, when the iPhone came out, you could have maybe imposed some regulations that would have limited the development of social media, or at least some of the ills that we're now dealing with today. But jump forward to 2022, and it's much harder to impose those regulations. There are a lot of sunk costs. There's a lot of industry clout that makes regulation significantly harder. So that's the when, the why. What about the how? How should we regulate? The precautionary principle, just to finish off the when question, precautionary principle and masterly inactivity. The first precautionary principle, this is a term borrowed from environmental law. This is the idea that if there is uncertainty about a certain kind of harm, but it's a real harm, you shouldn't wait for scientific certainty in order to try and mitigate against it. And that's been an argument in the context of climate change, for example. Masterly inactivity is a term that's occasionally used here in Singapore to refer to the way in which the government will not regulate, but will monitor sandboxes. So in the FinTech space, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore allows FinTech operators to have controlled experiments within an environment where there's no regulation, but the prospects of widespread harm are mitigated. So having talked about the why and the when, how should we regulate? Well, there's a lot of focus on the supply side. And actually, I think the real focus should be on demand side. So what are we trying to achieve? And here my own work divides up three reasons for regulation, three modalities of regulation, where we're trying to do slightly different things. In some situations, all we really want to do is manage risks. So in the context of transportation, we just want them to be safe. I don't think there's a real moral question associated with the fact that there's a human driver versus an AI driver. We can talk about trolley problems if people are very enthusiastic, but I think in areas like transportation, medical care, we really just want the technology to be safe, to get the benefits of greater efficiencies while mitigating the risks. And for all the deaths associated with autonomous vehicles, it's worth bearing in mind that 1 million people a year die on the roads, mostly due to driver error. So you've heard about every single autonomous vehicle error that has caused a fatality, but 1 million people die every year. And so there is a real potential cost saving there in terms of mitigating those risks. Secondly, however, there are some red lines. And here I would raise what I think is an easy example, but not a unanimously supported one, which is lethal autonomous weapons systems. I think most of us have a visceral wariness of delegating life and death decisions to an AI system. Now, the reasons you have that visceral wariness, though, might be complex. Occasionally, it's argued that in a combat environment, you shouldn't delegate such decisions because they're too complex, because all the peculiarities of battle, the difficulties of distinguishing combatant from civilian and so on, determining military necessity is too complex for a computer, you've got to rely on a human. I think that's a pretty terrible reason because for two reasons. The first is that machines are getting ever better at those classification questions. And the second is that actually a great many war crimes happen not because the situation is complex, but because people get angry, tired, they're racist, they're sexist, things that computers can be programmed not to be. Even if, however, even if the computer could make a better decision than a human, you still shouldn't delegate it, I would argue, for the reasons that the International Committee of the Red Cross highlights, that you should have meaningful human control, not because the human will make a better decision, but because these moral quandaries, life and death decisions, should be grappled with by a human, and a human should be able to be held to account in a way that a machine cannot be. And so this, I think, is a separate question. If the first, managing risk, is, if you like, a kind of utilitarian calculus, this is a deontological calculus, not consequence-based, but right-based. And so not just determining that the ends justify the means, but focusing very much on the means. There's a third category that not only would I argue should a human be making a decision, but there should be a particular human making a decision. And this is what I term process legitimacy. And the easiest example is that of a judge. That when a judge makes a determination about your guilt or innocence, potentially your custody of your children or not, we hope that he or she is making a good decision. But the judge is in that position of making the determination, not because he or she is the wisest person in the world, although we hope he or she is wise, but because he or she exists within a hierarchy of decision-making and accountability that has some political legitimacy within the society where that decision is being taken. And so if the judge were to outsource that decision to a machine, if he or she weren't making the decision, but outsourcing it to an opaque algorithm, then it would be comparable to outsourcing it to a for-profit corporation or to a third party. And I think most jurisdictions would regard that as a complete abdication of the judicial role. And in the same way, I think there should be limits on the ability of certain public sector decisions to be outsourced. In the literature, there's an idea of inherently governmental functions, which should not be outsourced. And in my own work, I've drawn some comparisons with the delegation, not just of life and death decisions, but certain public sector determinations of the rights and wrong and the rights and obligations of individuals. So I'm getting towards the end. I'm leaving some time for Q&A, but all this to say that this is a fascinating area, but it's also very fast moving. So I published a book on this last year, but the world refuses to stand still. Of course, just as I was finishing my own work, the European Union unveiled the draft AI regulation. So I managed to include some footnote references to it in my own work. Almost immediately, there was the pushback that all this will do is drive innovation elsewhere. In my own home country of Australia, there was a really interesting development. One of the questions that arises in this context is to what extent AI systems can and should have certain rights. There's a whole argument about AI personality that I'll touch on just before I finish. But Australia did rule back in August last year that an AI system could be an inventor for the purposes of patent law. Now that's just been overturned by the High Court, but this is a live debate going on around the world. South Africa has also held that an AI system can be an inventor. China, I mentioned, is becoming a really interesting mover and shaker in this space with very interesting rules on regulation of AI. And the United States, for all my comments about its dysfunction, has restarted a debate about algorithmic accountability. So there's lots of moving pieces here. I did mention there's this question of the rights of robots, and this is just one indication of one of the divisions, which is whether robots, in this sort of loose sense, robots should have rights. And some people in the top right have argued that they can and should have rights. I'm among those in the bottom left who say, yes, in theory, robots could have rights, but they should not. And there are other permutations. But I also use this slide not just to show the diversity of views, but also the diversity of speakers and actors in the space, much more diverse than that image back in 1956. But if you're really interested, this is the cover of my book, which came out last year. If you're interested, but for the moment, I would be particularly interested in hearing your questions, comments, and engaging in at least a brief discussion about these topics, which I, for one, at least find very interesting. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing questions and comments.
So would we have some questions or comments, please, from the audience?
All right, I can pose some to you. Would you get in a, hands up if you would get in an autonomous vehicle driving at full speed through a city? No one? What about driving at jogging pace around your university? I'd certainly do that. And in Singapore, we've got robot lawnmowers not far from where I am. They go zooming around with huge warnings. Actually, the biggest concern with some of these things is not, in fact, that the driverless vehicle or the robot lawnmower is going to do any damage. It's that some idiot student is going to stick his or her fingers under the machine and get injured that way. And indeed, that's one of the key challenges of AI, is not, in fact, navigating the world, it's interacting with humans.
I would have a question about maybe your new book. What are your plans to write new book about the artificial intelligence? Are you having those plans, or? I bet you have a great success on your book, We the Robots, but what about the future? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in the role I play at AI Singapore and AI governance, we're really looking at two things. One is whether we should trust AI, and that's broadly covered in the book, and there's lots more work to do there. But the work I'm fascinated by at the moment is the kind of will we in fact trust AI? So what is it that will shape human-machine interaction? What will affect that dynamic? These are the really interdisciplinary questions that we're, in AI Singapore, we're funding research within Singapore and beyond to try and look at behavioral economics, to look at psychology, ways in which that human-machine interface plays out. I mean, I touched on AI personality. There's one really interesting study which had 3 groups of people who were each asked to construct a toy robot. So this is not AI in any stretch, but it's just a good illustration. So they built this robot. I think it was like a Lego Mindstorms thing. So they build the robot, takes 20 minutes to build. And then the first group is told, okay, now destroy it with this hammer. And okay, they destroy it with the hammer. Then the second group is told, okay, having built your robot, now play with it for half an hour and then destroy it with a hammer. And half an hour, they hesitate and then destroy it. And the third group builds the robot and they say, now give your robot a name, give it a backstory, invent its life's history, play with it for a couple of hours. And then they come back and say, now destroy it with a hammer. You monster, how dare you? And there are all these interesting examples of how sort of the same device with slightly different packaging affects our interactions with them. So in Japan, they've experimented with robots dispensing medicine, a kind of robot nurse. And many of the patients responded quite negatively because you essentially had a kind of R2-D2 style trash can going around. It's very impersonal. But so even the simple act of putting a sticker with a name, calling it Susan or whatever, completely changed their interaction with it. And so this, I think, is one of the really interesting spaces that I'm not sure I'm the right person to write about it, but I'm certainly interested in learning more about it.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Good luck with your intentions.
Okay, well, my name is Daniel Arias. I'm from the University of Granada. And I think your presentation was really interesting. You also, well, you mentioned the 3 laws of Asimov, which are the basic, robot laws that, well, I'm sure we all know. The question is that artificial intelligence is going to base all the decisions on determinate algorithms, which are developed by humans. So the big question is that, okay, according to these 3 laws of Asimov, we can have that situation in which an intelligent car could decide whether to, run over 3 kids which are crossing the street at that time, or turn around and probably kill the driver. My question is, how can we solve that dilemma? And also, if you would buy a car which could kill you, I mean, imagine if you were a customer, you or myself, I mean, would I buy that kind of car, or if I would prefer that that car is going to save me, even though it's going to, you know, destroy some human lives? And I think that's a crucial issue that artificial intelligence will have to solve much further than those Asimov laws, right? So I don't know if you have an idea about that, or how things can go, or whether maybe philosophy should get in the field of artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Yeah, so on your last comment, there's a whole deeply problematic approach that we could solve all these philosophical dilemmas if only the machines could be given enough data. And I think that completely misconstrues ethics. I mean, we've been grappling with sort of trying to formulate ethical frameworks for centuries. And the reason we haven't sort of solved ethics is not because we're too dumb, but because these questions are insoluble, and also they're ever changing. And this is one of my own reservations about the use of AI systems for legal decisions, because I mean, when we talk about AI in this context, what we're talking about essentially is very elaborate statistical processes that are backward-looking, that are very good at establishing correlations, but for the most part, backward-looking, a bit like forecasting the weather. So weather is an incredibly complex phenomenon, but based on a certain amount of data, comparing it with historical examples, we can predict what's going to happen next. But if we did that in the context of law, imagine if we'd done that, say, 100 years ago, then only men's rights would be respected, possibly only white men's rights would be respected. If we'd done it 10 years ago, we would have had a very different position on same-sex relationships, for example. So law is and should be ever-changing. On the car question, I mean, it is a little bit artificial in two ways. One, machines are going to be so much more efficient at braking that the reality is anything the machine did would be safer than a human behind the wheel. But yeah, in a limit scenario, most of the systems are certainly being developed to prioritize driver safety. So nothing is going to run itself off a road in order to sacrifice the driver. It would simply try and stop immediately. And the kind of limit case in which somehow the brake cables have been broken, I think you would be more likely to have the physical machine failing than a kind of a moment in which the machine is calculating, okay, this many lives versus that many lives. Swerving would be important, and already the law requires you to act like a reasonable driver, and this will be an interesting challenge. So if I'm driving and I genuinely believe that it's a baby on the road in front of me, I swerve and into oncoming traffic and kill another driver, and it turns out that it was a doll on the road, not a live baby, I might still be forgiven because I behaved reasonably. If it was a rat on the road and I swerved into oncoming traffic to avoid the rat, probably it's not reasonable. And so one of the issues is, to what standard should we hold the machines? Should we hold the machines to the human standard or an even higher standard? And that's an interesting dilemma in all sorts of areas, including in bias cases where, I mean, we're all familiar, I think, with examples of biased machine learning processes. So Amazon handed over its resume screening algorithm to an AI system, which concluded that Amazon didn't want to hire women. Now, they were kind of horrified to learn that, but you shouldn't blame the machine for that. The machine didn't decide not to hire women. All it did was reveal that humans had been making biased decisions all along. And there is a danger sometimes that through the ability to interrogate an AI system, we hold it to a higher standard than a human. So if you ask an AI system, if you interrogate it effectively to say, are you biased? It will try and give you a truthful answer. Good luck asking a human if he or she is biased, because most humans will lie through their teeth. So all this to say that, yeah, I think these rules are less important than application, in the same way that, I mean, most jurisdictions, the law is written down. The law is reasonably clear. But if it was so clear, why do we need lawyers like me? Why do we need law schools? because the devil is in the implementation and in the application, which is something that we're not very good at yet, even with machines.
Thank you very much for answer.
Okay. Saulis Masteika, Vilnius University. So I would like to ask your opinion or insight, let's say, if we are talking about robotics and trust, law, regulation, do you trust in blockchain and smart contracts in the future, let's say, in Internet of Things, or let's say our cars are going to communicate with each other? So how are we going to implement the technology and blockchain and smart contracts? Do you see the future? Thank you.
Right, so a whole bunch of technologies. So blockchain distributed ledger technology, I'd always been much more interested in the kind of smart contracts, distributed ledger technology than in Bitcoin or Ethereum or all these other Ponzi schemes masquerading as currencies. I mean, when something's called a stable coin, to me, that suggests it's probably not very stable. So the current gyrations of the market, I think, are entirely predictable, but don't take away from the interest in the underlying technology. And what's interesting about smart contracts is, also what's dangerous. Because the interesting thing is the potential for taking certain transactions out of trusted regulators' hands. So if you have a self-executing smart contract, you and I can engage in some deal where it will be executed automatically and irrevocably, meaning that you can basically rely on not needing the intervention of a court, of a government apparatus to ensure that a certain transaction is followed through on. And in some circumstances that might be useful, but it's going to be most useful if you have a reason for keeping it out of government hands. So the advantage is you make it more efficient because there's no inefficiencies, there's no sort of sand in the gears in terms of government regulation, but nor is there the ability to check that. So it will make it more efficient, but also more attractive to people who are wanting to hide from governments, not just because they want efficiencies, but because they either want to avoid tax or avoid being arrested for engaging in illegal transactions. So that's some of the challenge of blockchain. IoT, Internet of Things, is just a way of saying, a bit like you touched on how cars are connected. There also huge potential for efficiencies, that if your food processor can be communicating with your fridge, with your scales, then they can combine and aggregate information about what you need to buy, maybe nudge you on not eating so much fast food or so much ice cream because you're putting on weight. You can get a lot of interesting data there. The question is why we're doing this and who's having access to the data. Because if it's helping you make informed decisions, so be it. If it's insurance companies trying to work out who they're going to give insurance policies to and to raise your premium because you're eating too much ice cream, maybe that starts to sound a little bit creepy. And so I don't actually have a problem with most of these technologies. It's a question of who is responsible for when they go wrong and who has access to the data that they're collecting. And that to me is where the really interesting debates are going to happen.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I had a question regarding these new tools. You're certainly aware that allows to generate images like DALL-E, for instance. You've probably heard of that. So I think it raises some of the questions that we are addressing in your talk like today, because today I can generate a new image that is very realistic and can represent maybe something like child pornography or whatever. And so I wonder what is your take on that? And also in this kind of tools, so today if I generate a new piece of art, so am I the owner of it? And also we have seen that the author, they try to limit these problems by introducing some Asimov-like laws. But of course people found ways to to avoid it. Like, for instance, you cannot generate an image of a dead horse in a pool of blood, but you can generate an image of a sleeping horse in a pool of red water. So yeah, so we see it's very difficult to do these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, the question of deep fakes is really interesting. So we're also looking at, in AI Singapore, one of the things we're looking at is the life cycle of so-called fake news. And what you're focusing on is clearly the tools to produce fakes that are very hard to distinguish. These tools have been developing very, very quickly. But in addition to that, there's the interesting question of why people are producing it. And sometimes they're producing it just for fun. Sometimes they're producing it as part of a hostile information campaign. And we've seen that, for example, with the probably the most extreme case, an artificial video of Volodymyr Zelensky surrendering in Ukraine that was clearly done by at least someone sympathetic to Russia. So we've got the supply, we've got the technology. Really interesting question on the demand side as well, like why people are interested in this. And there is a lot of evidence, unfortunately, that sensational, unrealistic, untruthful information travels a lot faster on the internet than boring truths. And so again, it's back to this interdisciplinary question that understanding this phenomenon is going to require more than just understanding the technology. We need to understand the way in which humans approach this technology. So yeah, we've recently concluded a challenge in Singapore to fight bad AI with good AI. And so we had some teams that were working out ways to determine whether a video was in fact fake. And I think you'll see a kind of arms race on that front, with the fakes getting better and then the ability to detect them improving as well. But it's entirely possible that 10 years from now, the old ideas that seeing is believing, that we will have to regard even, so a video presentation like this, you would have to regard as basically comparable to a whispered rumor, because you'd have no idea whether I'm in fact a real person or merely someone's artificial creation. Just another thing you mentioned really interesting is art and creation. So at the moment, only humans can produce copyrightable work. There are some interesting exceptions. So in the United Kingdom, there is a special provision for computer-generated art or computer-generated works. And those do receive some protection, but it's a lesser protection. So instead of, in many jurisdictions, the intellectual property right in copyright is life plus some number of years, often 70 years. In the case of computer-generated work, it's 50 years. And moral rights are also asserted in many jurisdictions. So moral rights, I have the right to be identified as the author of my work and for it not to be presented in a distorted way. Neither of those apply to computer-generated art. So we're really grappling with this. And a lot of this was theoretical until Saudi Arabia claimed to grant quote-unquote citizenship to Sophia, which they said was an AI system. It's actually a chat bot with a face. And there are some other examples of granting legal personality. And the European Union, I think in 2018, issued a report at least flagging the possibility that you might want to recognize legal personality of AI systems, either to blame when things go wrong, and that's back to the idea of the autonomous vehicle. Could you sue the car itself? Well, not much point because the car doesn't own anything, but it's not impossible. But also AI personality might not just because you want someone to blame when things go wrong, but to reward when things go right. And that's back to this AI patent I touched on earlier, that Dabus is a computer system that has been developing new patentable technologies. And there are some activists like Peter Thiel and Ryan Abbott who have been going around different jurisdictions saying, these are clearly patentable technologies and no human is claiming responsibility for them. Therefore, should the AI system be given, be recognized as the owner, as the inventor for that purpose, and potentially as the owner. And we'll see similar things in the context of art, although I think recent history suggests that it's not going to go anywhere. Some of you might remember the most famous selfie in the world was that of a black-crested macaque, which had taken a photo with a camera that a photographer had left in the bush because the monkeys would get too scared if he came up, so he just left the camera there. And eventually they taught themselves to take photos and seemed to enjoy doing so. And there was a whole set of litigation with arguments that actually the monkey should own the copyright. But the conclusion was that no, monkeys can't own anything. The human owns the copyright, but that was in the context of a settlement where this photographer agreed to give at least some of the royalties to protecting black-crested macaques. So for the moment, at least, law remains incredibly anthropocentric. We are at the center of the legal regime. And my own view, at least, is that we should probably stay there until such time as we're no longer able to justify that. But if it ever gets to that point, then the question might not be whether we're recognizing the rights of robots, but whether they're recognizing our rights.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Yes, we have one more question.
Hi, thank you. The question is about liability and the responsibility of AI systems. Now many AI systems or algorithms are probabilistic, and they work based on what they have learned and the cases they have learned. So this is a problem of the long queue, that you cannot build a system for all the cases. So in that case, that, for example, smart cards or any other AI system has a problem, or there's a lawsuit or something problem, for these cases that you cannot predict, that you cannot see before they happen, who is responsible for that? Are the developers, the company? Because this is something you cannot create your algorithm for, because you have not seen that before. So what about this? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. This is one of the challenges of deploying AI systems out in the world. If it was just a matter of navigating the roads, that would be easy. And many jurisdictions, I'm not sure about Lithuania, but many jurisdictions, trains are essentially autonomous. And that's partly because the rails are it's pretty clear where the train's going to go. So no, you can't always predict. And one of the things that is a challenge for AI systems, I mentioned earlier, is the interaction with humans. And for us, that's based on what we loosely term common sense. But common sense is actually incredibly complicated to translate to a computer. So that's why people are exploring with ideas of deploying naive systems that then learn through experience, because that's kind of how children learn. But thus far, that has been a difficulty, which is why we tend to focus on narrow artificial intelligence rather than general artificial intelligence. So we want to focus on discrete tasks. So with autonomous vehicles, I think the most likely scenario in the near term is dedicated lanes or dedicated sections of cities or highways where autonomous vehicles will operate to minimize those sort of unforeseen or unforeseeable interactions. So what happens if one of those does occur? Well, there are a few scenarios. The one I was mentioning earlier is you can have a shift from responsibility of the driver onto responsibility for the manufacturer. And so if you're using a food processor and you sort of put coconuts in it and that causes it to blow up, there would be an interesting question, okay, was that an appropriate use or not? And if it wasn't a ridiculous use, then quite possibly the manufacturer is liable. So you can have the kind of buyer beware of the old days. You can have product liability. There are two other possibilities that have been mooted in the literature. One, Ryan Calo, a very impactful author in this area, in 2011, he made an argument that actually AI systems should be given immunity and developers should be given immunity because of the risks of lawsuits constraining innovation. Now, that clearly hasn't happened. I think it definitely should not happen. But you could imagine a scenario in which AI systems were given immunity and the loss would land wherever it fell. So I don't think that's a good idea, but that would be a possible scenario. The other extreme, which I actually advocate in some situations, is mandatory insurance. So you could treat many AI systems, in particular embodied systems like devices, the way transportation is handled in some jurisdictions. So in my home country of Australia, Victoria, the state where I grew up, there is a mandatory insurance regime which essentially imposes a no-fault accident regime. So if you're in a car crash and you're injured, there's no need to sue anyone because we're all insured and you get covered, your injuries get covered through that insurance through that insurance scheme with a few limited exceptions. And this is relevant because it would mean that at least in some situations you wouldn't have to determine responsibility or liability. And again, it goes back to the question of what are we trying to do? And if what we're trying to do is minimize harm, maximize benefit, then maybe we shouldn't care so much about who we get to point a finger at, provided the harm is being addressed and the loss is being compensated.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No, I think we are out of questions. So, Professor Simon, it was a great pleasure to have you here with us, even though
virtually,
online. Yeah, even though online. But just let us know if you will be near Lithuania somewhere, or you about your plans. If you would like to come to Vilnius, just let us know. So thank you very much for being with us and for sharing your foresight and insights about the artificial intelligence. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you all in person one day.
So now we will have a coffee break for half an hour, I think. Yes, for half an hour. And then we will come back here in Aula Parva, in this hall. The work will continue further in networking in the group. So we will tell you after the coffee break, because I bet you need some coffee right now. Okay, so see you soon in half an hour.